Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second in a series of Doughty Street Chambers' Black Lives Matter events. I am Uele Burnham, a barrister at Doughty Street, specializing in mental capacity and mental health law, with some experience also of equality, human rights, and discrimination law. This series is intended to mark the significance of this year. As we said in the promotional material, this moment in this year is one which is very important for anti-racist thought and action. Action to which many of us were belatedly spurred by the callous, callow, and casual fatal violence we saw inflicted on George Floyd. What it seemed that event galvanized for us was that it was that his death was not in itself unique. What gave the horror of the footage its incandescent quality, and incandescent in the sense that it was clear, it was bright, and that it had combustible potential. What gave that footage that quality was its reflection, perhaps its reenactment of something, a kind of thing we had all seen before. And we'd all seen it before, not only because of the viral worlds we've come to inhabit, that is the worlds that are tied to screens like this one, by over-reliance on social media and the internet, and by coronavirus, but because this is an age-old story. And it's the age of the story and its repeated reenactment that energized the ensuing protests about monuments and about history in the US, in Belgium, here, and in the Caribbean. So this particular webinar is about monuments and what they mean in history. And I am delighted in these circumstances to welcome what I'd like to say is a panel of distinction to talk about what is it that our public spaces should say to us and of us. This evening, I would love to give the panelists as fulsome an introduction as they all deserve, but I'm really anxious to allow you to hear what they've got to say, and there are 6 of them. So I'm going to cut short the introductions, tell you a little bit about them, and then I'm going to ask each of them a series of questions which I hope tease out the kinds of things that we want to get to in this discussion about public spaces, history, and identity. And in particular, to look at what we've seen recently as the practice of statues being defiled, defaced, denuded, and actually sometimes annotated. So what I want them to talk about, what we're to do about those things in the public space. So in order of the contributions, we have Dr. Melanie Newton. Melanie, if you could give a little wave. Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto, specializing in the history of the Caribbean and the Atlantic. And she's the author of a series of publications on gender, slavery, emancipation, and Indigenous Caribbean history. In this context, she's written about Henry Dundas, the first Viscount Melville, after whom Dundas Street in Toronto and Melville Drive in Edinburgh were named. Then we have Ebenezer Azamati, a Ghanaian visually impaired postgraduate student who's reading for a DPhil in international relations at Oxford University, one of the sites of the Rhodes Must Fall protests in the UK. And I'm assuming everyone knows what I mean when I say about Rhodes Must Fall, and that's the campaign that was started in Cape Town in 2015 to remove the Cecil Rhodes statue from the university campus. And it also has, if you like, other segments of the group in Oxford. Azamati has had his own unpleasant encounter with the hallowed institution of Oxford Union, which failed, at least initially, to treat him with dignity. And he's going to tell us a bit about how he sees that as being linked to this discussion about statues in public spaces. Then we have Dr. Sarah Keenan, who is a reader in law and the co-founder of the Centre for Research on Race and Law in Birkbeck University, London. And her research interests span feminist post-colonial studies and concepts of property. One of the things I hope she will focus on is the British and colonial approach to sacred sites of Aboriginal peoples in Australia, in particular when juxtaposed against the traditional approach to monuments here. In other words, Sarah will be looking, I hope, at whose iconography should or should not enjoy protected spaces. Is our Aboriginal people's sites treated in the same way as the monuments that have come into issue here in the UK? Then we have Hugh Locke, who is a critically acclaimed artist. Hugh, if you could just wave there too. And he has exhibited internationally, and his work is collected by the Tate, the Arts Council of England, MoMA in New York, the V&A, the British Museum, the Henry Moore Institute, and the Government Art Collection, and others. I am quite beside myself that Hugh has agreed to join us, as his work itself explores the visual representation of power in public statuary, in portraiture, in money, and in costume. Hugh's decoration of photographs of public statues, Colston and Churchill, predates this round of what some might want to call the desecration of public monuments. And I'm excited to hear him talk about his work with those things and what he thinks about public monuments and what they should say. Then we have Caroline Addy, who is also a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, specializing in media defamation and freedom of expression. But she is also, in her spare time, I imagine, a common councilman of the City of London Corporation, which she tells me is a fancy way of saying she's a local councillor for barristers and persons in the Temple and its environs. She is also the co-chair of the Corporation of London's Tackling Racism Task Force. And that task force is charged with, amongst other things, assessing whether cultural and historic items such as statues, which have links to the slave trade, whether they have links to the slave trade, and if so, whether they should be subject to removal, annotation, or addition. Caroline, if you like, will tell us a bit about what can be done by way of policy at the local government level to address the kinds of issues that are arising for us tonight. And finally, we have David Lammy MP for Tottenham, whom I'm sure is probably the best known of all the panelists in the UK. He's the Shadow Minister for Justice. He's also an associate member of Doughty Street Chambers and has delivered, if I may say so, some of the most arresting parliamentary speeches on the Windrush scandal, on Brexit, and was extremely vocal about the neglect that resulted in the Grenfell Tower fire. His commitment to racial justice, I think, speaks for itself. It seemed only fitting that he should be invited to say something about government involvement or intervention at the national policy level on matters of this kind. So that's who we've got as a panel, an august panel, although it's October. And in sort of direct challenge to the notion of any prescriptive or nationalist approach, I'm going to ask Melanie, who is a resident of Ontario and of Caribbean descent, to go first. And I'm going to ask Melanie really to give us a little bit of a historical perspective to this, the business of the campaigning around statues that we saw starting in recent history in 2015. So Melanie, if I can put this out to you, can you briefly explain for us the roots or the genesis of what we're seeing now as a transnational movement to recast or review or remove historical icons? And tell us a bit more about how and why this movement became more intensified and fervent even this year. What can you tell us about that, for starters?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. So I think you said it quite well in terms of pointing out what the combination of the COVID crisis and the very highly public revelations about the scale of racist police violence, not just in the United States and not just in Canada, where it really targets Black and Indigenous people in the Canadian context, but globally. That really, I think, reignited, because it was not new, this movement but really got people, I think the COVID crisis in many ways, and the fact that it so clearly is having these health impacts on people who were the victims of colonial expansion in the first place. That there's like a direct connection between one's racialized relationship to that history and dispossession in the present. And it's the combination of those things that I think has really sparked this global anger that we are living and people are dying as a result of the unfinished business of that legacy. So I think that's the combination of factors that led to this explosion. The fact that in so many ways we are all globally sharing this pandemic, but it is so clear that the disparities are so follow this pattern in very particular ways.
Yes.
So that anger and trauma that led to the reigniting. But I would say that we have actually been here before. So as you say, this was a simmering, we saw this with Confederate monuments with the Rhodes Musqueam movement much earlier. But even before that, at the time of decolonization across much of Africa and the Caribbean, there was also another moment where these monuments were really under scrutiny. So it has resurfaced at different points as a central flashpoint of the question of what do decolonization and freedom and equality really mean? And what are these monuments that are symbols precisely to the opposite? What are they doing here? Right? What kind of work are they doing?
Yeah. And in some senses, if I could just ask you one more thing about that, I mean, what is the work that they're doing? I mean, there are those who say, well, there are two points of view, it seems to me. Some people say, well, this thing about monuments and defacing them or defiling them or removing them is a kind of sideshow. You know, it's either they say it's a sideshow, or they say, like our prime minister does, that if you remove them, then you're lying about history, which is a peculiar point of view, I say. But so what is the work they're doing, and what are people really trying to say when they're knocking them down and toppling them over?
So I think let's just take a couple of examples of these monuments to talk about the work that they're doing. So the Colston Monument, which was so famously tossed into the sea in Bristol Harbor, that was actually erected in 1895. So that's something like 200 years after Colston actually died. Many of the monuments to Cecil Rhodes were erected several decades after he died. Many of the Confederate monuments in the United States were built at the height of Jim Crow segregation. So what they actually do is to elevate, they're built in particular moments to give a public legitimacy to a particular narrative, not just of what matters about the past, but structures of power in the present. So this idea that there's some kind of transparent window into the past is nonsense. There are reflections of the order of power and what was considered a legitimate kind of power in the moment when they are erected. So I think that's part of the work that they do. The other thing that they do, however, that I think is really important is that obviously, if you think about South Africa, the United States, in many ways, and in the Caribbean, the sort of structures of racial colonialism and inequality that were so profoundly and obviously undemocratic have reformed. There has been change. So in terms of access to voting rights, access to public services, there are certain kinds of changes that have happened that are considered a central part of the legitimacy of modern democracies. These are not equal societies, but there are certain claims to equality that societies now make that are kind of necessary to be legitimate state actors. So what these monuments have done, in the fact that they have remained through these reforms, is to serve as a reminder in many ways of where power really lies. And where the ultimate, that even through all of this change, the economic order, the racial order, that is not fundamentally going to be transformed. That this is still, there's still something redeemable in some way about the political structures that these monuments represent. So that is the other really sinister work that they continue to do, to bring those narratives of power forward into the present as a policing tool and a legitimation for forms of violence against, again, the victims of that kind of racial inequality. They do a certain legitimating work in reinforcing the continuation of inequalities.
So when we, for example, Melanie, look at the work you've done on Henry Dundas, who's I think a significant name for Ontarians and Scottish people, and we learn also about his role in enslaving and his violent actions in relation to Maroons in Jamaica and directing other violent actions against the Garifuna community in Grenada. How do we sit with that, or how do we sit that with the Melville Monument in Edinburgh, Dundas Street, Dundas Square? How do we, because in a sense, would you say in this connection that we're to remove them, or are we to annotate? Are we to say something else in addition? What do you say about that?
Well, I think different monuments are different. The first thing I would say is that I think it's one of the ironies. I can talk more if we have time about the specific histories of Dundas. He himself was not a slave owner, as far as I'm aware, but he was the Minister for War and Colonies at a really pivotal moment in Britain's history, where honestly, in that moment, in the 1790s, the British government had a choice about how it was going to align itself in relation to the French Revolution. And it really clearly chose to try to use this moment to expand the limits of slavery. And Dundas was really the architect of that policy. He was, by all accounts, the individual in the government, in the cabinet at that time, who was the strongest advocate of that policy. So that's the policy that he pursued in the Caribbean with quite genocidal results. And so I would say, to answer your question, that in many ways, these monuments, it is precisely the fact that we have to have complicated conversations about them. So the Melville Monument, for example, is not the same as, say, the existence of slave castles on the West African coast, which are also part of this history as the locations from which Africans where they were held and then transported. So castles like Elmina, for example, yes, which are also part of this sort of monument, this transnational conversation about monuments, but what we should do with them is not the same. Yeah. But what I would say is that it's one of the terrible ironies is if we compare the kind of protection that the Melville Monument has enjoyed with the fact that, so in St. Vincent, which is the place where Melville orchestrated a genocide against these Afro-Indigenous people, the Garifuna have struggled for decades for the protection of the island, so to get heritage status for the island where their ancestors were imprisoned and from which they were then exiled. So this is this island called Ballyso. And they have been struggling to get protection for this island, which is a sacred site for the Garifuna people. And even though the last autonomous Garifuna leader is a national hero in St. Vincent, they have been unable, because it's a privately held island, it's for sale for $9 million, it doesn't have protected status by the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines wants to see it sold for the tax revenue. So there's this terrible irony that if we look at the consequences in the present, the monument to the man who orchestrated this violence has been protected in Scotland, but the location, the island where the victims of this violence, that this is a sacred site for them, has no such protection.
Yes. I mean, that's a very interesting point, and actually dovetails with, I think, some of the issues that will come up in Sarah's presentation. So I'm really grateful for you raising that, Melanie, at this point. Thank you. I'm going to move on at the moment, Melanie, to the next presenter, because I'm conscious of how many interesting points of view I've got to include. But thank you for that. That's really helpful. Now, I'm going to turn next to Ebenezer Azamati. And Azamati, I'm going to ask you a little bit about yourself and your experience as a student at Oxford. And I think that many people know about the experience that you had with Oxford Union, or know a bit about it, but many may also not know. So I'm just going to ask you in your own words to describe what happened to you in that event that took place at Oxford Union.
Thank you very much for the opportunity afforded me. I have to say I'm the least qualified to be on this panel, but I'm very grateful for the honor done me.
Probably not.
It's an experience that I would never wish on anyone. Not only because I had gone out of my way to go and reserve a seat for myself, as a person with disability at the Oxford Union as a lifetime member of this institution, and then returned to take
there
my
was a
seat.
public debate, wasn't there, that you had wanted
Yes.
to attend, and yeah.
So there was a debate on that fateful 17th of October 2019, and this debate basically was titled, "This House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government," and I wanted to attend that debate. I have to put it on record that I am a lifetime member of the Oxford Union who paid the same amount as every other lifetime member of the Oxford Union. Yet no reservation of seats were made for me as a person with disability. So I had to go out of my way to go and get myself a seat and then return later to take the seat. But unfortunately, I wouldn't be allowed to take this seat. And as they say, the end was what everybody saw in the videos and the newspaper publications. It was a horrendous event that occurred, and an incident I would never wish on anyone. Not only is it emotionally draining, but it also speaks to how much spaces are not accommodating of the needs and feelings of people largely in the West.
But what I wanted to ask you about that, Azamati, is that how do you see that issue where, in a sense, you weren't accommodated or arrangements had not been made for you to access that hallowed institution? How do you see that as linked to this issue of statues and public spaces?
So there is one major common thing that runs across public space. The Oxford Union is a public space. And once I am a member, I am entitled to be there when spaces are available. In this case, I had reserved for myself a seat. So it meant that there was a space available. Where the Rhodes statue is located is a public space as well. When people are passing by, especially people from the southern part of Africa, are passing by and they lift their eyes and they see this statue, what does it remind them of? The Oxford Union is a public space. When I went there and this incident happened to me, any other person who has similar protected features like me, who goes there subsequently, would be reminded of this incident some way, somehow. Therefore, what I'm driving at is the fact that these are public spaces that have been designed to ignore the emotions and feelings of people simply by failing to accommodating the needs of such people in society.
And so when we're thinking about the link between what you experienced and, say, Rhodes Must Fall, I mean, what I understand from you is that you're saying that, in a sense, the existence of Cecil Rhodes's statue in where it is in Oxford at the moment is a failure to accommodate the histories and the realities of those who, for example, might be regarded as his victims. I mean, of course, yeah. Now,
certainly, and not just that. Sorry, certainly, and not just that, but also it makes it also a glorification of the nonsense imperialist views.
Right. And so but others might say also that there are statues, for example, in throughout the UK, there are statues of Churchill. There are other statues of persons who are celebrated. I mean, Churchill is obviously associated with being the wartime leader in this country. So what do you say about that? I mean, Is your view the same about that, or is it different? What is the standard that you think we should be applying when we're thinking about what statues ought to remain in public spaces? What's the sort of test you're looking at?
Well, any such argument that believes in the preface to your question that there are so many other statues around the UK, therefore Rhodes must be kept, is not only logically pathetic, but also an argument that makes nonsense of intellectual discussions, in the sense that, one, statues are not only erected to celebrate individuals, okay? In fact, the major reason for erecting statues is to celebrate events. Now, if Winston Churchill, and just let's even get beyond the borders of the UK for a second and talk about people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, etc. Because we have their statues publicly displayed does not mean that we are celebrating the fact that they owned slaves. No. In the same vein, the fact that we have Churchill's statue erected all over the UK doesn't mean a celebration of the famine he caused in Bengal in 1943. No, that cannot be right. We are celebrating those people for the event they stood for, i.e. Churchill being celebrated for leading the UK to fight Nazi Germany, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington being celebrated because they led revolutionary America to fight imperial Britain and then ended up gaining independence for America. That is why their statues are erected.
Right.
So if anybody is able to explain why such Rhodes statue should continue to be celebrated publicly by pointing to any singular event, that of course can be discussed. But we all know Rhodes to be an imperialist and a colonialist. So if the British are so much happy to now celebrate imperialism and colonialism, then yes, they can subscribe to any such argument. I have to also add that, look, people have argued that statues are symbolic and we are trivializing arguments regarding racism and inequalities when people say statues must be brought down. This is unfortunate because if they are only symbolic, why do councils across Britain continue to expend so much money in maintaining these statues? It means that they mean something beyond symbols.
Yes. All right, Azamati, I'm going to have to stop you there to bring in the others, but I think you make two really important points. One, that there's something about events that might be marked, and second, that there is something more than symbolic about the erection and the maintenance of monuments. All right.
If you have a minute, I'd love to make the third point, which is really important.
We'll come back to you if I may, Azamati, but I'm just anxious to get everyone in. Thank you. Right. So next, I'm going to move to you, Sarah, and I think this is an interesting point at which I'll ask you to come in, because I noted a kind of clear connection between the things you've been thinking of and the things that Melanie in particular was saying. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is that you mentioned, certainly to me in preparation for this panel, about there having been an incident of Rio Tinto engaged in mining near or on a sacred Aboriginal site in Western Australia almost 2 weeks before the drowning of Colston. And I wanted you to just tell us a bit more about that and how you see that as linked to the question of cultural heritage and identity and statues that we're discussing.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So I guess to take us back out to the colonies and to the settler colonies in particular, following on from Melanie, But on the 24th of May, so just 2 weeks before Colston was pulled down, Rio Tinto, which we all know is a very large mining company, was going about its everyday business, and part of that business was expanding one of its iron ore mines in an area known as the Pilbara, which is in the north of Western Australia. And this process of expanding the mine involved detonating liquid explosives at a very large scale. So they drilled a series of almost 400 holes and exploded them. And in doing so, they destroyed some caves known as the Juukan Gorge Caves, which are the oldest human shelters in Australia and possibly in the world. So these are caves with evidence of continuous human habitation going back 46,000 years. They're the only archaeological site that had evidence of occupation throughout the Ice Age, throughout the last Ice Age. And there were sites of obviously significant archaeological artifacts, but also of cultural meaning for the present traditional owners, who are the Pudukuntu, Kurama and Pinakura peoples. So obviously that's sort of, it's not about statues and it's happening far away, but I see it as connected to the questions of heritage and of British heritage in two ways. It is the question of heritage on a legal basis, because the destruction was facilitated by the Aboriginal Heritage Protection Act. So there was nothing illegal about this destruction of a cultural site. It was very much facilitated by law, a law that, it is ostensibly about protecting Aboriginal heritage. And in detonating these explosives and destroying these this Aboriginal sacred site, Rio Tinto is continuing a very direct lineage of British imperialism. The land is stolen in the first place. There's no treaty for this land, and the sovereignty of Aboriginal people hasn't been ceded. The mining lease was granted by the Crown in the 1960s to encourage excavation. Aboriginal people were violently prevented from returning to that land. They're still violently prevented from returning to that land. And so I guess the actions of Rio Tinto are linked to an element of British identity, which is imperialism, which is continuing today, and which is not part of the conversations that tend to occur around, pulling down Colston.
Yeah. So well, it's a sort of exportation of that. But what I was interested in about what you were saying, Sarah, as well, is that, for example, those who talk about pulling down roads or Colston and moving and just removing them from public spaces are doing so in the interest or in service of, it seems to me, the sort of revisiting of a partial history. So they're doing it with a purpose, an educational purpose in some ways. Whereas Rio Tinto is detonating those caves purely as an act of extractive capitalism. So there's and that, if anything, has historical significance. If what I'm to understand is correct, it holds within it matters of completely obvious archaeological interest. So there's a real hypocrisy there, it feels like to me.
Absolutely. In a way, I don't want to compare the two because they're so incomparable, but the Australian example is perpetuating, Rio Tinto is perpetuating an imperial violence, whereas those who are tearing down statues are opposing that violence and also bringing it into a contemporary context. Yeah. But I do think it's interesting in terms of what the label of heritage does in both instances, because I actually think that labeling what happened in Western Australia as destruction of heritage is on the assumption that Aboriginal culture is located in the past, and actually the traditional owners of that cave are very much alive and present and practicing their culture today. So the heritage sort of works for law and I guess for capital in the Rio Tinto example, whereas those in the UK and South Australia who are sort of fighting to to retain the statues call on heritage in a different way, to put forward a particular understanding of empire, a sort of whitewashed understanding of empire. Yeah.
So in just to close, Sarah, I mean, for this part of the questioning, what I was wondering is there a sense, so the detonation meant the end of the sites completely? I mean, is that what's happened? It's been destroyed, end of, or
it has
one
been,
doesn't know yet?
No, it has been destroyed. The caves have been destroyed. I mean, I was reading that there's actually been a sort of surprising public condemnation of the destruction, which is interesting for me as an Australian, because that's what we do. We destroy Aboriginal sites constantly, but it's had quite a the CEOs have lost their $1 million bonuses, which is more consequence than most mining related destruction of Aboriginal sites. But yeah, they've been destroyed. Rio Tinto did go about a salvage operation where particular objects were taken and sort of, have been put away somewhere to be looked at by archaeologists later. But yeah, it's that site has gone. Yeah.
Thank you for that for the moment, Sarah. I'm just going to move things along and join up with Hugh now to talk a little bit about his work and art, and that I also think has a connection to Aboriginal people's rights as well, but we'll come to that in a moment. Hugh, one of the things that I specifically wanted to talk to you about, wanted to mention in this connection, because of course you are this is, I would assume, predominantly a legal audience. And one of the things I wanted to say, to talk to you, to mention, was the fact that you had been commissioned and did do the piece for the, pardon me for 1 second. Yes, you did do one of the most important and arresting pieces of public work that I think there is now, I would say, and I'm not biased, is the jurors at Runnymede, which you did, and which is the 12 intricate bronze chairs that I think people can see on the screen now. I hope they can. And each of those chairs has its own representation of a particular story of a struggle for rights. And it was done for the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. And I wanted to come back to talk to you, Hugh, about the specific difference between this public work and the kind of statues we've been talking about. The statues of the great persons, the Churchills, the Nelsons, the Queen Victorias, etc. But so I'll come back, if I may, to talk to you about that. But before we get to that, one of the things I wanted to ask you is that it feels as though even before we got to this sort of confected argument about culture wars and statues, your work seemed to have been about playing with these icons of greatness, about troubling the notions of statues as immortal and history as fixed. It's almost as if you anticipated the moment at which the Colston statue was going to be sunk in Bristol Harbour, by the way in which you toyed with the statues of historical and iconic figures. And I know that I have our Ray, who's helping with the slides. There's some slides of the photos that Hugh has done, or the decorations he's done to the photos of, say, for example, Queen Victoria, and indeed Colston himself in 2006. So there it is. So Hugh, what I was going to ask you first of all is, why are these figures not sacrosanct to you? And is it important to you that they're not seen as sacrosanct? Can you hear me, Hugh?
Unmute. That's an important button to push.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Okay, right. So it's what this is about is I started getting interested in things which nobody else seemed to be interested in. That statues which were, people walk past and not see them. They were invisible. They were so visible that they were invisible. And I started thinking about, who are these people? And they're all these heroes of days gone by and stuff like that. But they are quietly sitting there as representations of power. You know, they're representations of a particular power structure. Very, very silent, very subtle in some ways. You know, by subtle, I mean, they were not, some of them not shouting too loud, except for Nelson way up on the column and all that, you know. And I started working with these things, thinking, and then what I realized I was doing was trying to control my environment, trying to control the society I was living, trying to build a new alternate narrative for myself, you know, and basically messing around with these things because they're there to be messed around with. But for many people, they're part of a heritage industry. They're part of this important sense of national identity. So when you start to get on bad and want to pull things down, people are going to get vexed, you know, and quickly say that nobody cares about these bloody statues until you want to take them down, you know, which is anyway.
Yeah, but so what? But when you put, as we've seen in the ones there, when you drape or adorn these statues with what we might otherwise see as bling, and I know that it's more than bling. It's there are all sorts of intricate objects you've drawn in there with specific significance. But what is it that you're communicating to the public about these figures, and what are you trying to do to the public perception of the figures?
I'm trying to mess with them in a very attractive way, you know, sort of like a broken kind of beauty, you know what I mean? Like a mindful vandalism, I call it. You know?
I've read you describe it as that, and that sounds to me to be an apt description.
Yeah, I mean,
and a very powerful one of what's being done.
The statue, he's covered in cowrie shells, and that's significant because cowrie shells, that's what you use in the slave trade. So it's basically showing people again who the guy is. And a friend reminded me the other day that, whoa, what happened there? A friend reminded me the other day that in 1989, I was living in Bristol and we were driving past Colston, and I said to him, he needs to go, you know. And I'd sort of forgotten that by the time I came around to do this piece in 2006.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's gone to a certain extent anyway.
He's gone, and that, for most of us, for me particularly, is a complete shock. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime at all. I just didn't think that was going to happen. You know?
Well, just taking you forward a bit, Hugh, to this other thing about your work, and I think I see it in the work. And I'm a complete ingenue as far as art is concerned, and the kind of work you do. But it seems to me that the playing with the statues that you were doing in this kind of work, with the adornment and you know, different approaches to busts of Victoria and different ways of presenting the Queen. What we have there, what I saw from that is a kind of an explicit or an explicit and an incipient challenge to the very notion of heroism, the very notion of the hero. The statue is the person we gaze at.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, and I just wanted you to comment on that. That's what I saw in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole hero thing, I mean, for me personally, I have a real problems with the whole concept of a hero, because they always let you down, quite frankly, you know. To the point where this piece, the jurors, is specifically described as right from the outset. This is about people who had important things happen to them. They're important in the history of justice and human rights. but they're not a parade of heroes, specifically not a parade of heroes. That was the mantra repeated over and over with the jurors. Yeah, quite a difficult thing to work on, to be honest.
And there is something, I think I heard you speak about this on another program, there is something to be said for the fact that this statue is at the level of, not statue, sorry, this monument or this piece of work is not elevated. We're not meant to look up at it, but we're meant to be part of it.
You sit down on the chairs and you engage the thing, and it becomes animated. And it's about 12 people sitting down having debates or discussions about ideas of justice, ideas of human rights, ideas of law, and it fluctuates. When I was doing this piece, there were many issues which came up on these chairs. And at that time, for example, the chair referencing Aung San Suu Kyi, she was untouchable at that time. I thought, well, that's fine. I got that chair sorted. That's representative. There are no problems with that chair. And as we know now, there's a big problem. The point of this is, as I said at the beginning with this particular piece, this is not a parade of heroes. And also beware of who you rise up to become a hero, because they can have feet of clay, you know what I mean? Or feet mired in blood for some of them.
And quickly before we leave, before you leave us at this stage, well, this bit of the questioning for you, Hugh, what about the chair that represents Lillian Lenton,
Lily Lenton for me is interesting. She was a suffragette, and she was one of the first people arrested and force-fed in prison. And I find, and the image is taken of her is taken from a police surveillance photo while she was in the prison yard. And Lily Lenton was arrested for burning down the Kew Gardens tea room, and she basically left a note saying this was done by two voteless women, and she's quite an extraordinary figure, but she was a terrorist, and obviously I don't think that, but I mean, but officially in the time she was a terrorist, and today I find that instant. Today I wonder whether people would not think of that act as an act of terror, a terrorist act. You know, I mean it's because people it's so hard to explain. It's I find the distance of history and time really, really interesting. How things are read. You know.
Yeah. Right, well, Hugh, thank you for that, for this moment. And I'm going to now take that with me and move to Caroline and ask her a few questions about her work as the co-chair of the Anti-Racist Task Force of the Corporation of London. So Caroline, we've had a kind of overview of how these movements have gained kind of currency. And what's being done by someone like Hugh in public spaces, what is felt by people like Azamati about Rhodes, etc., being in public spaces. And so I suppose I'm turning to you to ask, well, what are people like you who sit on these councils engaged in doing? And I think you are engaged in doing something. So I just wanted to ask you a few questions about what that is. You know, sure. What does the task force do? What does it hope to achieve in relation to statues and monuments?
Well, we were set up really to take advantage of this moment and of the momentum that it's created to make change effective. And my co-chair, Andrian Myers, and I agreed right at the outset that we were not at all going to make the case for why change was needed, because like so many other bodies, the City of London Corporation has signed up to fine principles and wonderful sounding, you know, charters, etc., to do with diversity, equality, inclusion, and all the other modern buzzwords. So it was not necessary to have that argument. The important thing was to say, well, how do we make it real? Culture is just one of about 7 strands that we're working on. So we started with the staff of the corporation. because they don't reflect the makeup of the city in which the corporation is situated, and to try and set out concrete measures that would change that and improve the experience for the BAME staff that the corporation already has. And we've looked at a lot of other things as well: education, police, business, health and well-being, which cuts across all of those, you know, the way in which the experience of racism affects the health and well-being of BAME people and how to deal with that. Now, the culture aspect, which is not concluded, we haven't had our discussions, but what we have done is commenced public consultation. And I hope everyone who's listening will answer it, because we have a few days left for it to run, because we just wanted to find out what people thought and what people wanted. And I think that's very, very important in Britain, because we are, all of us to varying degrees, very good at what a friend of mine called comfort history. There is a very powerful national myth, and it is, you know, premised on certain things about, on certain qualities that the Briton is supposed to have, and on, I think, the idea that we have a very sort of virtuous history, and that we've always been the people who fight tyranny. You know, we've always been the rebels, not the empire, which is remarkable when you consider how extensive the empire was. So our work is determinedly pragmatic and practical. But with the culture strand, we find ourselves pulled into what is a different kind of debate, which is also sort of philosophical and historiography.
So when the consultation responses come in, is there going to be a sort of period where you take all the consultations, and then there'll be a report produced and recommendations made about what to do with the statues?
Exactly.
And other historic sites. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it's fair to say we have not made any promises that we will, if you like, go with the majority view. We want to be informed, but I think that the task force has to make its own decision. There are some areas of obvious discussion. So Francis Beckford, whose statue is in the Guildhall itself, is commemorated because of his stand for freedom of expression and other rights in Britain. And he's excoriated because of his heavy involvement in slavery and profits from the Royal African Company. And it bears out what he was just saying, and really what's also apparent when people talk about Churchill. Many people are heroes and villains. And it's, I think, our national failing that we don't like to have those sorts of nuanced conversations about historical figures and historical events. We tend to go for the sort of a rather blanded out popular culture, you know, version of these things.
Yeah, I heard somebody, I heard Ashtar Kar, who's a Navarro media commentated, say that one of the things she got, images she was left with of Churchill from the general mainstream press was that he was like everyone's jowly granddad. And not, it wasn't the same as the person she'd heard about in her home about the Bengal famine and so on.
Well,
so
that's
there is
exactly
that
right.
Real tension. Yeah.
And what is also interesting, and it applies to a lot of the people from, say, Colston to Sir John Cass, whose statue has already been removed and his name taken off the primary school that was named after him by the governors, not the corporation, is that we are very often holding to a view of particular historical figures that is at odds with their contemporary reputation. There are many people, I mean, if you want to know what a lot of people thought of Churchill, you read anything said by Lord Halifax and other figures of Churchill's own time, and they were extraordinarily critical of him, couldn't stand him. His speeches were sentimental and embarrassing. And we do this with a lot of the excuse me, a lot of the figures whose statues we are talking about. And when we do that, we seem to forget or take at face value the acts or events that lead to them being commemorated. A lot of the philanthropy of people like Colston, for example, may well have been made out of the deepest principles of, you know, goodwill to fellow men, or it might have been PR, it might have been reputation saving, it might have been religiously motivated because you're about to die and you really rather go to heaven than hell, so you start giving your money away. And at the moment, when we talk about what is apparently now being described as contested heritage, we're not having those sorts of more sophisticated conversations. It's why I dislike the culture wars appellation, because as soon as it is applied to something, it makes people feel that there is a binary and they've got to pick a side. But that's absolutely not true.
No.
It's much
it
more.
Also, I think it also disguises the reality of what's being discussed in a sense, but because it places that, it places some camps in favor of history and some against history, and that's really a nonsense in relation to all of this activity. This is history. What's happening is history.
Yes.
I think.
I mean, there are a couple of things I will just say about that. One relates to something that Hugh said about, the passage of time, because I wonder how long ago is so long ago that we no longer feel we need to interfere with particular monuments. I mean, if you're a Roman emperor, is it so long ago that deeds don't matter? If, to bring it to the city context, you're in the early modern period, like Thomas Gresham, and you have an involvement of some kind in the nascent slave trade, is that too long ago? And we're going to need to find a way through this that is coherent. And the other thing is that context is everything. If you are the only person whose statue sits in the Guildhall itself, you have been given a prominence, and that may require a very different decision from somebody who has a plaque in a back street that no one particularly cares about. A good example of that is that in Ghana, in Independence Square, there used to be a statue of Mahatma Gandhi. And a few years ago, students at the University of Legon complained about the statue being there because his statements in his years in South Africa about Black Africans were so derogatory. Now, if Mahatma Gandhi had been anywhere else, I don't suppose people would have minded so much. But in Independence Square, at the heart of Ghanaian national life, that was very uncomfortable, and the statue was removed, to the complaints actually of the Indian government, who felt that this was traducing Gandhi's real legacy. So we're not the only people grappling with these questions.
Yeah. It's a wide transnational question, which brings me, thank you, Caroline. I'm going to move on there today because he's been waiting patiently, having had a long day himself. But David, this seems to be the point to bring you in. How long ago is too long ago is a good question. And then I want to ask you some questions about some more intricate questions about government policy. But how long ago is too long ago in relation to these, in relation to public commemoration?
I mean, I don't really understand that question, Uele. Do you mean those that we hold up, or those that we take down?
And in some senses, because one of Caroline's points was, if are we looking at Roman emperors, for example? Are we looking at, is that too long ago to actually say you want to, in public spaces, if you like, renegotiate the terms of the occupation of the public space? And the reason why I see that,
I think the focus is the modern period and modern history, and so I think the thing that we have to focus on here is what is contested and what is in play.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we are in Europe, and in Europe, whether you are in France, in Holland, in Spain, or indeed in the UK, you are dealing with imperial powers who colonized the world, who enslaved my ancestors and yours, and that is a truth, and that is a truth that cannot be erased. You then get to how you negotiate and deal with that truth. And here in the UK, we're living in a country that has not been invaded since 1066. The Great of Great Britain means something to much of the British population. And there is a sense of we tell history. and this is a history of the colonizers, not the colonized. However, here we are in 2020. There is a real and growing ethnic minority population. There is a shift in society, particularly, I think, for the millennials and for Generation Y. That shift is in part generational in terms of attitude, not just attitude on issues of race, but attitudes on issues of sexuality, attitudes in relation to climate change and a whole range of things, but also actually what they are inheriting. Because the truth is, for those of us who are a bit older, Generation X or baby boomers, it doesn't feel to them like they're inheriting quite the same deal, particularly economically. So they're up for looking at this Britain in a slightly different way. And the truth, I think, of a civilized country, and certainly those of us who are lawyers feel this quite strongly, is the way that that country deals with its minorities particularly. And so I think we're dealing with modern history. We are dealing with a truth that can't be erased. And here in the UK, for much of this discussion, we are dealing with, frankly, an abhorrent history in relation to the enslavement of many, the partition of countries, the scramble for Africa, and the handling particularly of the Indian subcontinent and more. And that truth is not going away. And actually, here in the UK, when we come to 2034 and we come to a discussion about emancipation and what happened in emancipation, which is that Black people were freed but had nothing, no money, no anything to build anything, and the slave owners got all the cash, and we only ended up paying it a few years ago. When we get to that truth, you then also get to a real conversation that the Caribbean countries have already begun, and African countries are joining with on reparations. So this subject is not going away. And actually, just to end that point, when you look at those images coming out of Bristol, at the throwing of Colston into the water, what struck me, and let me just be clear, I'm Shadow Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, and therefore I saw an act of criminal damage being committed, and I'm not condoning acts of criminal damage. However, that's for the purposes of the Daily Mail. What I am going to say is this, that I was asked to do a review on disproportionality in the criminal justice system. And what I found in that review very squarely is that when it comes to sentencing, there is disproportionality of sentencing between white individuals and Black individuals. And what I saw with those young people that were throwing Colston into the water was overwhelmingly white young people. And they were using their white privilege to commit an act of criminal damage because they feel so strongly about these issues, and that fills me with hope. And they were doing it fully understanding that if it were a crowd of Black young people throwing Colston into the water, the criminal justice system would disproportionately jail them for considerably longer than those youth who look rather privileged to me are going to deal with. So there's the hope, but this is the moment, I think, into which we're responding. Yes,
I mean, I think that thank you, David, for that, and that's a really important point to make about the composition of what appears to be the protest movement in the UK, and that it is actually quite multiracial. I mean, I think I've got some other questions that I want to ask you about, David, but about, for example, I think I'll ask you one more question because I know you've got to go quite shortly.
Well, I'm going to run on because I'm conscious that I don't want to skip the discussion, and it's so interesting listening. So I'm going to let the clock run.
All right, I'll ask you one question because I'm conscious Melanie has to leave as well. But it's that we also know, for example, that there's a campaign called Memorial 2007, who wanted to erect a monument to enslaved persons in Rose Gardens in Hyde Park. And what happened when it would appear to me from my research that what happened is that they were told, well, at the moment they have planning permission to erect the statue, which is quite a small statue in the realm of statues, I'm told, public statues, and they need £4 million to build it, to erect it. Meanwhile, there is a very a Holocaust memorial that is actually, well, there seems to be a big public inquiry about this as far as I can detect, but there's a Holocaust memorial proposed for the Tower Gardens, and that has been given 75 million pounds of funding from central government, or that amount of money has been allocated for this project. Now, there's no way, it seems to me, in which we should be in the business of hierarchizing oppressions, etc. But it seems to me that one of the things that arises here is the question of when Britain is looking at itself and wanting and thinking about itself, it doesn't want to think about its role in slavery as a state. It doesn't want to think about that. So that's something that seems to be relegated, not funded, not prioritized. Where the Holocaust is concerned, that is a story of British victory in a sense. Not the Holocaust, but obviously its role in the Second World War. So that seems to go into the funding streams. And I wondered if you had anything you wanted to say about that particular issue.
Well, look, so I've said this before, I've written about this before. British history, as it's taught currently in our schools and has been taught really since the 1948 Education Act, hasn't changed that much, largely revolves around the two H's. Henry VIII and the birth, if you like, of the Enlightenment period and Britain breaking off with Rome, which kind of births a greatness, if you like, and that Protestant move that we were at the center of, that was really about Henry VIII's determination to murder his wives and have his way. And we don't quite put it in the way that a gender studies course might, but we ought to. And two, the Second World War and the preoccupation and the deep belief that Britain stood alone for much of the beginning of the Second World War. In fact, the truth that Britain stood alone is so powerful that there was a recent Hollywood film about it. The fact that there were soldiers from Guyana, the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the empire stretched across all those pink bits of the globe, and there was no sense in which Britain stood alone at all at any moment. And that, in fact, it won the war with the help of Russia and America, is passed over. And so the truth is that the Holocaust was a horrendous crime against humanity. I have never been keen on the business of moral equivalence, but I'm absolutely clear. And I think any right-thinking person has to be absolutely clear that the enslavement and the murder and the treatment of those who were brought from Africa is an abomination and also a crime against humanity. The problem is it requires the country in which I live and in which I belong and in which I'm raising my children and in many ways in which I love, in many ways, it requires this country to look into itself and to be real and honest about that painful truth. And my reckoning is that that moment has not yet come. And therefore, there is a pecking order. And it's in a sense, this goes back to that moment I said before. What makes me proud to be of the descendant of those enslaved people is that I'm still here. And that I look at you, Uele, I look at Hugh, and I look at others. We're still here. And our ancestors had not a dime. And it breaks my heart that we are scratching around for £4 million to honour something that should have been honoured a long time ago. But I know that justice is on our side, and that keeps me going.
Okay, thank you, David. That's probably a good point at which to take questions and or to ask Melanie, because I'm conscious that Melanie might be leaving or has left. I don't want her to leave just yet.
I'm still here, but I am going to have to go, unfortunately, in a minute.
I realize that. I just want, for that reason, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to anything that anyone in the panel has said or anything you wanted to pick up on quickly before you leave. You've got
so much. Yeah, I would say, I think precisely this larger question of heritage and the notion that, I think at a particular moment, and it ties in with questions of how we are rethinking our relationship to the environment and so on. The notion of building these statues, and we think about the things they're built out of, like marble, bronze, the sort of the way that they glorify even the process of creating them, the sort of extractive basis of empire, for example. There are all of these wide-ranging questions about that do tie into the conversations we've been having about in different kinds of symbols of indigenous commemoration and relationship to the landscape. I think the ultimate example for me is Mount Rushmore in the United States, which is, you've got the faces of the four white supposedly founding fathers of the United States carved into what had been an indigenous monument in North Dakota, I think it is. I can't remember exactly where Mount Rushmore is right now, but I think it raises these wider questions about how we as human beings in an age of climate change sort of mark our own presence in the world and mark our own history in ways that reflect the best that we can imagine of how we move through the world. And I think this is at a very profound level the question that this raises. And I think a context in which we need to think about some of these 19th century monuments, that they are also speaking to a relationship with climate, with the natural world, with the very materials out of which they are made, that is no longer who I think we need to be as a society. So,
yes, thank you. That was an excellent snapshot, Melanie, for the time we had. Thank you very much. And if you've got to leave now, I say thank you again so much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so I think what I'm going to do now is there any, I'm going to give an opportunity for a couple of minutes for anybody on the panel to come back on what someone else has said, and then I'm going to ask if people want to ask any questions, and I'm going to try and respond to those that have been raised in the Q&A function. So has anybody got a burning issue they wanted to respond to that one of the other panelists raised?
I do have something to add, but
Okay.
I will appreciate it if I would be allowed to share this thing for everybody to have a look. Now, anybody looking should just read this document, which I copied from a huge document from the Allies when they were occupying Germany after the Second World War. Now, if you can read on the screen, you realize how much the Allies basically commanded the German government and the military generals who were occupying Germany at the time to destroy all Nazi statues, all memorabilia, anything having to do with the Nazi regime in Germany. Now, of course, this is a right call. It is, however, interesting how much the same people who commanded
the destruction of all statues relating to the Nazi Party, now turn to themselves and say that, oh, people who were imperialists and colonialists, who were involved in the slave trade that took away and killed more than 12 million people, should be allowed to stand. It just goes to tell the hypocrisy embedded in the lives of various British governments and their various policies that they have championed over the years.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment because I'm concerned that I want to give the panelists, the audience, a chance to ask some questions. So I think, if I'm right, your point is that actually the Allies dictated quite carefully what happened to Nazi emblems and symbols, etc. And they are in museums now, some of them in places where people can go and see, but they're not in public spaces. So that there's a hypocrisy at the heart there in relation to the response of the British state to these issues that we are raising. So yeah, that's an important point, and I take that on board. And I'm going to just have to move though to see if there are questions that I think need to be put to the panel. And looking at the questions that have been raised, I think one of the things that has come up is whether or not the question whether empire is the correct discourse. What about colonized? I mean, I think that many members of the panel have used empire or colonized interchangeably. Any views on that, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, empire involves colonization, I think. So I guess I think of the British Empire, and that the colonization is the process through which it expanded itself. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, I don't know what the basis of that question was particularly, but it seems to me that that's my understanding of the use of the terms by members of the panel. There's a question here that I'm not sure if anyone is able to answer, but it's about whether the panel have any comments on the recent memorial in Nairobi to victims of British torture in Kenya, erected after the court case brought against the UK government by survivors. It seemed to get a lot of attention in Kenya, virtually none in the UK. I'm aware of the court case. This is the Mau Mau, the case about the Mau Mau. And but I'm not aware, I wasn't aware myself of the monument. Was anybody else aware of it?
No.
Doesn't seem, yeah, I mean, it's one of those quintessential problems that aspect was not reported here. It's the way that our news is relayed in some senses. The other question that I think that has been asked is whether or not the issue, this was probably a question for you, Hugh. Someone has said no one has mentioned the aesthetic quality of the sculptures. It is particularly important. This is a particularly important aspect of historic monuments, not simply what they represent, but how and why they exist as works of art.
This is important to talk about, because the Colston statue, aesthetically, for me, as Victorian statues go, it's the most attractive statue in Bristol, was the most attractive statue in Bristol. What's really interesting about that statue is, for me, is the pose. You know, the guy's got one hand, he's leaning on it on one hand, you know, thoughtful, thinking great thoughts, thinking like enlightenment thoughts and stuff, worrying about the future of his city and stuff like that. And it's a clever trick in a way, because you have to tell yourself, if you don't know, that this guy's a monster, you know. But the whole aesthetically is posed in a particular kind of way, you know. I'll just skip on to another statue, the statue of James II in Trafalgar Square, or from the studio of Grinling Gibbons, right? This is not a Victorian statue. This is way earlier than that, right? And it's beautifully done. James II as a Roman emperor, but James II was the guy who ran the Royal Africa Company. He basically ran the official slave trade. The slaves, thousands of slaves were branded DY for Duke of York on their skin because of him. But then aesthetically, it's a benign thing, you know, and that's the trick these things are trying to fool you with, you know what I mean? They're not benign, you know, they have a bloody history behind them, you know.
That's right. I mean, I think one of the issues I'd heard mentioned in relation to this issue of the Memorial 2000 is that it's which I don't know if you know about, Hugh, but the underfunding, and there have been comments, and I don't know how sound those comments are about the artistic merit of the statue. Do you know anything about that?
I can't comment on that. I haven't looked into that personally.
Right. Okay, but I mean, I don't know whether that's just a criticism, because it's not. It's an issue that somehow those in control of public spaces don't want to be in a public space. But I don't.
Some things people would rather brush under the carpet, put it that way, you know what I mean? Yes. I mean, my feeling about all this debate is like, there's a bunch of people quietly going, wow, if we keep quiet, let's calm it down a bit. These people are gonna go away, you know what I mean? Leave us alone, you know what I mean? If you just everything we'll go on to the next thing next year, you know what I mean? But this is not really going away, I don't think, somehow, you know. This is not going away, not this time.
So what do you say then, Hugh, in relation to this question for you? What do you say as an artist about what's the role of art and activism in this connection, to keep it on the table, so to speak? Well, I mean, I know what you're doing about that, but how do you see the establishment or the institution more widely dealing with that?
Well, I mean, I think you need. I was going to say committees, and someone said committee. That's a disaster, you know, because committees. Too many damn things. We've done that. I mean,
except mine, of course.
Of course. I was thinking. I was going to come to that. You know what I mean? But you need more people to be speaking up publicly about this. So it's not a thing where a prime minister will say words to the effect of, okay, this is over. We've gone too far with this. That's what's been coming out of number 10, you know. And I'm thinking, right. I was expecting this. The backlash coming in quite slowly but surely, swinging in. You know what I mean? And yeah. But the people I saw marching in the Black Lives Matter movement, I would like to think that they wouldn't accept anything less than some form of change, you know. But it's a long story, long, complicated story.
Yeah. Well, we're yet to see. I mean, because as you said, that this wasn't something you had envisaged in your lifetime. That some of what we've seen, including Colston sleeping with the fishes, you didn't expect to see that. I think I'll raise one more question that Melanie did answer on the Q&A, but I'll raise it, and it alludes to something I raised with Hugh, and I'll raise it with open to the panel, and I think we'll take that as the last question the panel answers before we come to time. And it's whether or not statues and monuments of individuals are now obsolete. And Melanie gave an answer to that online. And I was hinting at that to you, Hugh, when I said there's a distinction between the Juras as a public work of art and these other statues of great men who were supposed to be, who we're supposed to revere. Now, is that time over? And I'll take, as I'm speaking to you, I'll ask you, Hugh, and then I'll ask everyone else for their contribution.
Okay, for me, it depends on the society. In Jamaica, there's a necessity, it feels, amongst local Jamaicans, you have to have a Bob Marley statue, you know what I mean? And it's not a tourist thing, you know, this is a genuine need. So there are genuine needs to have representations of certain individuals. And I'm talking about beyond this society, you know. But a monument doesn't have to be something which is a figure of a human being. It could be something quite different, you know what I mean? Something very, very different, something very subtle. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be 10 foot high. It can be quite small. It's the significance of what the thing is, you know?
Yeah. And there are many of those, and I suppose that's the point that was being raised, which is the age of the individual, the demagogue, over, and are we moving on? But anyone else want to come in on that? Caroline, Sarah?
Yes.
Sorry. Can I quickly say something and then I have to go? Because
I know.
Yeah. I would just say that I think that it's a really good question, and whether it's you know, the age of the individual. I mean, in some cultures that age has never been, and it's all iconography exists, but it's not about the valorization of, you know, of particular men, essentially, which is how it tends to be produced here. And yeah, I think Melanie's gone now, but I thought that was a really important question to think about, what the materiality of what this iconography does and represents in terms of the human relationship with the non-human environment, as well as how we think of ourselves as humans and as a society. And it's not a question I can answer, but the sort of valorization of statues, and even the fact that we're, you know, so much fuss about these statues, which is such a small element of what is culturally produced in the world. It's just one specific image of like what history and society looks like. Thanks so much. I have to run.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thanks very much. I'm just going to offer it to Caroline, and if David wants to say some closing words, and then leave it at that.
I hope it hasn't gone, because I think it still has its usefulness. I mean, one thing people don't always realize is that a lot of the statues that we're talking about were themselves not necessarily put there by great men to memorialize their colleagues, but were often funded by public subscription. And so there might have been a groundswell of popular support for people. I think that the very business of putting those statues up was often literally to make concrete a particular attitude towards those people, so that, you know, you were making sure that your idea of who that person was and what they did was the one that survived. But I see no reason why people should not, on a sort of community level, continue doing the same thing. And in another way, I think that statues still have the power. Statues of human beings have the power to move us and change us. The one I always think of in this context is the one that was on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square, Alison Lapper pregnant, and it made a real impact. So I hope that we don't lose the habit of making statues of other people. But I agree that we probably need to think more carefully about how and when and where we do it.
That leaves David and Azamati, if you want to say anything in closing.
Well, there's quite a lot I could say in closing, but I mean, I think it's to say that of course, we will continue to want to memorialize individuals, but equally we have to accept that our ancestors may want to, our descendants may want to review that memorialization. I hope that one day there is something that commemorates a statue, a memorial, a monument, the great men and women who never get discussed in our curriculum, and those are the individuals that fought for their freedom and led rebellions in the Caribbean. In Guyana, we talk about coffee. The Jamaicans talk about Sam Sharp. There are a whole list of names. And I doubt that moment will come in my lifetime, but I hope it comes, because we will have arrived at a place. And it's just to keep in mind that in the end, this is not about the individual acts of whom we memorialize. It's about the context in which the debate can be had, in which the funding can be sought and won, and in which there can be a degree of unanimity really on that point. And therefore, I suppose I would want to end making a political point, it's terribly sad that we have not arrived in a place of cross-party consensus on so many of these issues. It's deeply depressing that we had an equality minister at the dispatch box suggest that these issues of structural racism and discrimination are down to critical race theory, and that was dangerous. And this was done seriously, and that there is a sort of attack on this, and there is a determination, whatever one feels around the term, to create, yes, a culture war. And I say that because it's to say that we're living in serious times. Aging population, coronavirus pandemic, huge inequality, real problems with manufacturing and work, particularly in Western economies. And the truth is, rather than deal with those very serious issues, to turn these concerns into a sort of minority concern to be attacked, a populist nationalist concern, is a very, very serious and acutely worrying moment, because we haven't actually seen it with that degree of venom and deliberation really in our lifetimes. So this is a terribly serious debate because of the plaything that our political leaders are determined to make it. But at the same time, we've got this tide. We're having this debate on a day in which just 2 years ago, I was vilified for raising the issue of white saviorism in relation to comic relief. A large segment of the British population did not understand what I was talking about. My constituents were applauding and hooting as they passed me in their cars. And I think most of this audience understands what I'm talking about, but there are a lot of people in Britain who found it very, very hard to give up the trope that they were attached to. But today, Comic Relief have announced that they are moving away from sending celebrities to hold babies and portray dead children on TV live for people to give money. Finally, that's progress.
Right, thank you. I think we're about 3 minutes past now. As Matty, I asked you if you wanted to come in. I think you haven't, or you're not going to. And Caroline, you
So, just a moment. So my final comment, thank you for the opportunity, but I want to also add that so many people have hastily generalized that people are calling for all statues to be brought down. No, such hasty generalizations and quick demonization of people who are calling for certain statues to come down would not be the solution in the end. What the right solution is, we should begin to have critical discussions about these matters and begin to understand how much emotions and feelings and historical past are important, and the need to also contextualize these issues. It is also important to note that when people are calling for the removal of statues, it is not any attempt to trivialize the issues of systemic and structural racism and issues of inequalities in our country, in this country. It is important that that is done in tandem with putting in place policies that would make it possible for equality to be the order of the day one day, even if it's not our time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I think I'm going to call it to a close now. I think we've run 5 minutes over time. And so I'm going to thank all of the presenters, those present, those absent, those who've already left, profusely for contributing to what has been really thoughtful and thought-provoking debate, I feel. And to my mind has touched on some of the really important issues about this debate, which is to sort of reject this notion of a culture war and actually look carefully at what people are wanting to do when they're wanting to revisit who it is we deserve, or who it is that deserves to be in public spaces and spaces to which the public should have access. It seems to me what the panelists on the whole are saying is access isn't just an issue of whether you can get in the gate. It's an issue of how are you being represented by the things that are in the park? And that affects notions of access and belonging and identity and history. So thank you very much to everyone for being part of this. It was smashing to be able to chair this. It was a privilege. Thank you so much. And hopefully those of you who are still there in the audience will attend the next seminar, which I'm sure Izzy and Ray, who are responsible for things at the marketing end in Chambers, will let you know of very shortly. Thanks again. Thanks to everyone. Good night.